That overwhelming, screaming dread we talked about, the one that emptied streets and shattered the comforting routines of your medieval life, it doesn't just dissipate into thin air. Fear, especially fear of an unseen, inexplicable, and seemingly omnipotent enemy, has a nasty habit of curdling into something even uglier. The desperate, irrational need to find someone, anyone, to blame. If the horror isn't just a random act of a pitiless universe or the inscrutable will of God, if there's a human hand behind it, then perhaps there's a target for your rage, a way to impose some semblance of order on the chaos, a villain you can fight. And so, as the bodies pile up and hope dwindles, you witness society turning inward, not in shared grief, but often in furious, misguided accusation. The great, tragic, and utterly futile pointing of fingers begins. You see, the idea that this relentless pestilence is simply a natural biological event, a disease carried by something as mundane as a rat or a flea, is, as we've established, completely outside the dominant intellectual framework of your 14th century world. You've heard the learned explanations involving miasma, imbalanced humors, and unfavorable planetary conjunctions. You've heard the sermons blaming collective sin, but for many, these abstract causes aren't satisfying enough. They don't offer a tangible enemy. When your child is dying in your arms or your entire village is being wiped out, the human mind craves a more direct culprit, a scapegoat upon whom all the terror and grief can be focused. When faced with an invisible killer, the medieval mind, and perhaps the human mind in any era under extreme stress, sometimes went, "Clearly, this is Bernard from down the lane. He's always looked a bit shifty, and his well water tastes distinctly funny these days." Spoiler alert, it was almost never Bernard being anything more than his usual, slightly odd self. Pre-existing prejudices, simmering social tensions, and economic resentments all get thrown into this toxic brew, and certain groups find themselves squarely in the crosshairs. The most prominent, most systematically persecuted, and most tragic victims of this desperate search for scapegoats during the Black Death were, without a doubt, Jewish communities across Europe. This is a grim and undeniable mainstream historical fact. For centuries, Jewish people had lived as a distinct minority in many European Christian societies, often subject to legal restrictions, confined to specific quarters, ghettos, barred from many professions, and frequently targeted during times of social upheaval or religious fervor. They were the perpetual other, making them an easy target when fear and paranoia ran rampant. As the plague devastated towns and cities, the horrific and entirely baseless accusation began to circulate that Jewish people were deliberately causing the pestilence by poisoning wells, springs, and food supplies with the intent of destroying Christendom. The sheer illogicality of this claim, given that Jewish communities were also suffering and dying from the plague at rates often equal to or even exceeding those of their Christian neighbors due to their often more crowded living conditions, was completely lost on a populace crazed with fear. It seems like a pretty significant flaw in their supposed evil plan to kill all the Christians if they themselves were dying in droves too, wouldn't you say? But terror, as you're witnessing firsthand, has little use for logic. The accusations were often accompanied by lurid, fantastical details, often extracted under brutal torture. Here's a truly quirky and horrifying tidbit. These confessions described the supposed plague-causing poisons in grotesque detail. Perpetrators, it was claimed, used concoctions made from a veritable witch's brew of ingredients: the hearts of Christians, flesh from hanged men, spiders, owls, lizards, human spittle, consecrated hosts, the communion wafer, which to desecrate was the ultimate blasphemy, all supposedly ground into powders or mixed into potions by rabbis and then distributed by a shadowy international Jewish conspiracy to contaminate water sources across the globe. The official recipes for these plague poisons sounded like something a particularly unhinged goblin chef might dream up after a very bad night. A pinch of spider venom, an eye of newt? No, wait, the confessions say owl, and the tears of a disappointed angel. Perfect! That should do the trick. These outlandish tales, born from the darkest recesses of fear and hatred, were nevertheless widely believed and circulated, further inflaming the murderous rage of the mobs. The consequences were catastrophic. From 1348 to 1351, a wave of violent pogroms swept across parts of France, Switzerland, the Holy Roman Empire, especially the Rhineland, and other regions. In countless towns, Strasbourg, Basel, Erfurt, Mainz, Cologne, to name but a few, Jewish quarters were attacked. Men, women, and children were dragged from their homes, accused, and massacred, often with appalling cruelty. Some were burned alive en masse, in specially constructed wooden buildings or in their own synagogues. Others were drowned, tortured to death, or given the choice of immediate conversion to Christianity or death. In some instances, entire communities were wiped out. The authorities' responses varied. Pope Clement VI, from his court in Avignon, issued 2 papal bulls in 1348, unequivocally stating that Jewish people were not to blame for the plague, pointing out that they were dying just like Christians and that the plague afflicted lands where no Jewish people lived. He threatened excommunication for those who persecuted them. Some local rulers and city councils also tried to offer protection, sometimes sheltering Jewish residents in castles or fortified areas, but often these efforts were too little too late. Or local authorities were themselves complicit or simply unwilling or unable to control the frenzy of the populace. The Pope would issue a strongly worded bull saying, "Hey, maybe don't massacre innocent people based on insane conspiracy theories," and the mobs, caught up in their bloodlust, would essentially be like, "New parchment, who dis?" and carry right on with their horrific work. Moreover, there were often ugly economic motivations intertwined with the religious fanaticism. Persecuting Jewish communities allowed debtors to wipe out their debts to Jewish moneylenders, one of the few professions open to them, and for rulers or citizens to confiscate their property. Another highly visible, though very different, manifestation of the desperate search for meaning and an end to suffering was the flagellant movement. Imagine large processions of people, sometimes hundreds or even thousands strong, men and women, though predominantly men, marching from town to town across Germany, the Low Countries, and France. They are often barefoot, dressed in somber robes marked with red crosses, carrying banners and candles. Their faces are grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of fervent piety and apocalyptic dread. As they enter a town, they form a circle in the marketplace or before the church and begin their ritual. Twice a day, for 33.5 days, symbolizing Christ's years on earth, they would scourge themselves publicly. Stripped to the waist, they would whip their own backs and shoulders with leather thongs often tipped with sharp iron spikes until they were bloodied and bruised, all while chanting prayers, confessing sins, and singing mournful hymns known as Geistlerlieder. Their belief was that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's wickedness, and that through this extreme act of public penance, this imitation of Christ's suffering, they could appease God's wrath and persuade him to lift the scourge of pestilence from the land. Their motto might as well have been, "Got sins? We've got whips, and we're not afraid to use them," repeatedly. Their public displays were undeniably a powerful spectacle, and their back muscles must have been truly incredible. Initially, these flagellant groups were often met with awe and reverence by the terrified populace. Many saw them as holy people, undertaking a sacred mission. However, the movement soon became a source of social disruption and controversy. Their processions could be unruly. They sometimes claimed to be able to perform miracles or forgive sins, usurping the authority of the established clergy, whom they often criticized for corruption and for failing to avert God's anger. More ominously, their fervent, apocalyptic preaching and their search for sinners could easily tip over into blaming others. While their primary focus was on self-punishment, some flagellant groups were implicated in stirring up anti-Jewish sentiment, directly accusing Jewish people of causing the plague and sometimes instigating or participating in attacks. Some flagellants even carried letters they claimed had been delivered by an angel, endorsing their movement and condemning various groups. The church, initially uncertain how to react, eventually grew alarmed by the flagellants' challenge to ecclesiastical authority,
their potential for inciting social disorder, and their increasingly heretical claims. Pope Clement VI condemned the movement in late 1349, and secular authorities began to suppress them, sometimes violently. This leads to an ongoing open scholarly debate. Historians still debate the primary motivations behind the anti-Jewish pogroms during the Black Death. Were they driven mainly by spontaneous, popular religious hysteria and fear, fueled by centuries of theological animosity and the immediate terror of the plague? Or were economic factors, such as the desire to cancel debts owed to Jewish moneylenders and seize their property, equally or perhaps even more significant drivers, with the accusations of well poisoning serving as a convenient and socially acceptable pretext for violence and plunder? The answer is likely a complex interplay of all these factors, varying in emphasis from one region or incident to another. Jewish communities and the clergy weren't the only ones to face suspicion. Other marginalized groups also became easy targets. Lepers, already feared and ostracized, living in isolated leper houses, were sometimes accused of spreading disease. Foreigners, or any outsiders whose customs or appearance differed from the norm, could fall under suspicion. In some areas, accusations of witchcraft and malevolent magic, though perhaps more characteristic of later centuries, were also leveled against individuals, often women, who were blamed for causing illness through demonic means. Even the poor and destitute were sometimes viewed with suspicion, seen as more prone to sin and thus more likely to attract divine punishment that then spread to the wider community. You witness all this desperate, tragic pointing of fingers, and you realize the profound human need for an enemy, for an explanation, even a false one, in the face of incomprehensible suffering. The real culprits, Yersinia pestis and its flea-ridden rodent accomplices, were of course completely invisible to the 14th century eye and mind. While everyone was busy blaming their neighbors, persecuting minorities, and flagellating themselves half to death, these tiny organisms were probably having a good chuckle, if bacteria could chuckle, and diligently booking their next tour date across the continent. The tragedy was compounded. Not only were people dying in droves from the disease, but communities were also tearing themselves apart from within, inflicting further suffering based on fear, hatred, and a desperate, futile search for someone to blame, when in truth, there was no human hand guiding this particular apocalypse.
While society outside the sick room is convulsed with panic, pointing accusing fingers or engaging in dramatic acts of penance, as we just saw, there's another, more methodical, though equally desperate battle being waged against the Black Death. This is the realm of the physicians, the university-trained medical minds of your 14th century world. These learned men, steeped in ancient texts and complex theories, are now confronting a disease that mocks their knowledge and shatters their paradigms. You, if you have the means and fall ill, or if your town council is enlightened enough to hire one, would look to these figures for guidance, for some rational intervention in the face of overwhelming, inexplicable suffering. Their desperate gambits, however flawed by our modern understanding, represent the pinnacle of medical science as your era knows it. Imagine your typical medieval physician. He's likely a man of considerable social standing, having endured years of rigorous study at one of Europe's prestigious universities, perhaps Paris or Montpellier, renowned for their medical faculties, or Bologna or Padua in Italy. His education would have been overwhelmingly textual, centered on the revered writings of ancient Greek masters like Hippocrates and especially Galen, whose voluminous works formed the bedrock of Western medicine for over a millennium. He would also be familiar with the great Arabic commentators and physicians like Avicenna, whose Canon of Medicine was a standard textbook. A medieval medical degree basically meant you were exceptionally skilled at reading very old books, usually in Latin, could engage in complex scholastic debate about the qualities of humors, and could nod thoughtfully while inspecting a flask of someone's urine. Job done, right? Well, not quite when Yersinia pestis comes knocking. The medical world has its own hierarchy. At the top are these university-trained physicians who primarily diagnose and prescribe, often disdaining hands-on procedures. Below them are the surgeons, more practical men who deal with wounds, fractures, and perform operations like bloodletting or lancing abscesses, often under the physician's direction. Then there are barber surgeons, who, as the name suggests, cut hair, pulled teeth, and performed minor surgical tasks. Apothecaries prepare and dispense the complex herbal remedies and medicines prescribed by physicians. When you consult a physician, his diagnostic tools are limited. He'll observe your general appearance, take your pulse, a skill Galen wrote extensively about, and, most importantly, conduct uroscopy, the meticulous examination of your urine, assessing its color, clarity, sediment, and even smell, believing it offers a window into the state of your internal humors. As we've discussed, their understanding of disease is dominated by miasma theory and humoralism. They believe the plague is caused by a corruption of the air, a poisonous miasma, likely generated by unfortunate astrological conjunctions, earthquakes, or decaying matter. This bad air then enters your body and disrupts the delicate balance of your four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So their primary strategies revolve around preventing the miasma from entering your body and attempting to rebalance your humors if it does. Astrological considerations are also vital. A good physician would likely consult an astrolabe or ephemeris to determine the planetary influences at the time of your illness and to choose auspicious moments for treatments like bloodletting. In response to the Black Death, medical faculties and prominent individual physicians across Europe began to produce a flood of writings known as plague treatises or consilia. These documents, a key mainstream historical fact of the medical response, aim to explain the plague's causes, offer preventative advice, and detail supposed treatments. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, as we mentioned, famously attributed the plague to a triple planetary conjunction in 1345. Gentile da Filino, a renowned physician from Perugia, wrote one of the earliest and most influential treatises before succumbing to the plague himself in 1348. Others like Jacome de Agremont in Catalonia and a mysterious John of Burgundy, possibly a pseudonym, also penned influential tracts. These treatises were laboriously copied by hand and circulated among the literate, offering the best available medical wisdom, though this wisdom was often contradictory and ultimately ineffective. The plague treatises were like the medieval internet, brimming with advice. Some of it sensible-ish for the time, much of it utterly bonkers. One might solemnly advise, avoid south winds, damp evenings, and existential dread, which, to be fair, isn't terrible life advice even now, just not particularly helpful against a rampant bacterium. Preventative advice in these treatises is extensive. To combat miasma, you'd be counseled to keep your house well ventilated with good air, perhaps by burning aromatic woods like juniper, ash, or pine. Their air filters, essentially, were elaborate bouquets of flowers or smoldering branches. Effective against a persistently bad mood, perhaps, but Yersinia pestis wasn't exactly going to be impressed by your potpourri. You'd be told to avoid swamps, graveyards, and smelly industrial areas. Some physicians advised carrying pomanders filled with ambergris, musk, or complex herbal mixtures. Diet was crucial for maintaining humoral balance. You might be told to eat moderately, avoiding moist foods like fish and dairy if you were considered to have an excess of phlegm, or opting for cooling foods like cucumbers if you were too choleric. Moderation in all things, sleep, exercise, even emotions like anger or excessive joy, which could overheat the humors, was key. Some even advised against bathing, as it was thought to open the pores and make one more vulnerable to miasmatic invasion. Personal hygiene advice could be a mixed bag.
When it came to treating those already sick, if you called for a physician, he'd likely arrive with a grave face and a determination to fight the disease according to established principles. Feeling a bit plaguey, are we? The doctor, after careful consideration of your urine and pulse, might declare, a distinct surplus of corrupted blood, and your black bile seems to be throwing a rather unruly party. Let's try more leeches, and perhaps avoid any form of joy or excitement for a few weeks. That should sort it. Bloodletting, or phlebotomy, was a go-to treatment. Specific veins were chosen depending on the perceived ailment, and a precise amount of blood would be drained, supposedly to remove the peccant, or diseased humor. Purging, through emetics to induce vomiting or laxatives to cleanse the bowels, was also common. For the buboes themselves, some physicians advocated lancing them with a heated scalpel to release the venom, while others preferred drawing poultices made from ingredients like figs, mustard, or even pigeon dung, believing these would pull the poison out. One of the most highly prized and complex medicines was theriac, also known as Venice treacle. This ancient antidote, whose recipe often involved 60 or more ingredients, including viper's flesh, opium, rare spices, and various herbs, was painstakingly prepared by apothecaries and considered a powerful panacea. It was the medieval equivalent of an everything bagel super smoothie, an energy drink, a health supplement, and a cure-all rolled into one expensive package. Given the sheer number of ingredients, the thinking might have been that something in there simply had to work, right? Right? Narrator: It did not, at least not for the plague, though the opium might have made patients feel a bit less distressed about their impending doom. Other complex electuaries, medicinal pastes, with equally exotic ingredients were also prescribed. Here's a quirky tidbit regarding other protective measures. Some physicians and learned individuals recommended wearing specific amulets or talismans. These weren't just simple charms, they could be quite elaborate. Precious stones were thought to have prophylactic powers. A sapphire, an emerald, or a piece of jacinth or hyacinth worn against the skin was believed to ward off plague. Sometimes these stones would be engraved with astrological symbols or religious phrases. Written charms, perhaps containing biblical verses, names of God, or magical formulas, might be folded and worn in a small pouch. The idea that sound could affect miasma also led to some interesting advice. Listening to pleasant music was sometimes suggested to maintain good spirits and thus a healthy humoral balance, while avoiding sad or mournful sounds was considered important to prevent a melancholic disposition that might make one more susceptible to the disease. Now, about that iconic image of the plague doctor in the beaked mask, it's important to note that while some form of protective garment was likely used by physicians who treated plague patients from early on, the full, elaborate costume with the bird-like mask, long waxed gown, gloves, and staff is more definitively associated with later plague outbreaks, particularly in the 17th century. The famous beak was designed to be filled with aromatic herbs like mint, cloves, camphor, or vinegar-soaked sponges to filter out the miasma. The waxed gown was intended to be impervious. While perhaps not widespread in the 1340s and 50s, the concept of protecting oneself from bad air was certainly there. That striking plague doctor costume wasn't just for material protection. It also became a powerful symbol, a figure that screamed, "I am here to either cure you with my arcane knowledge, or perhaps terrify you into a state of wellness. Or, failing that, I might just be measuring you for a coffin." Despite all their theories, their treatises, and their desperate treatments, physicians died from the Black Death at an incredibly high rate, often comparable or even exceeding that of the general population, precisely because their duties brought them into close contact with the sick. Many, like Gentile da Foglino, perished while trying to understand and combat the very disease they were studying. This leads to an ongoing open scholarly debate.
Historians and medical historians still discuss how much genuine empirical observation and potential innovation occurred among physicians during the Black Death versus a mostly rigid adherence to ancient authorities. While many plague treatises do appear to largely reiterate Galenic principles, some scholars argue that the sheer overwhelming scale of the catastrophe, the manifest failure of traditional methods, must have forced at least some degree of practical adaptation and questioning, even if it didn't lead to immediate breakthroughs in understanding the disease's true nature or effective treatment. The intellectual ground was, perhaps, being ever so slightly disturbed, paving the way for future, albeit much later, medical revolutions. For Mao, however, the physician's desperate gambits, however earnest and learned, were tragically unequal to the challenge.
The desperate gambits of your learned physicians, their bleedings and their theriacs, their solemn consultations based on ancient texts have, as you've witnessed, proven tragically, catastrophically futile against the relentless onslaught of Yersinia pestis. The Black Death continues its horrifying march through your community, through your continent, leaving in its wake a silence that is far more terrifying than any scream. Now, you and your fellow survivors are confronted with a problem of almost unimaginable scale and horror. What to do with the dead? The sheer overwhelming number of bodies threatens to physically and psychologically suffocate those who remain. The somber, Herculean task of managing the mortal remains of a significant portion of your world's population begins. Imagine the scenes that become sickeningly commonplace. In towns and cities, houses stand silent, entire families wiped out within days. Sometimes the bodies lie undiscovered for a time, until the unmistakable odor of decomposition alerts neighbors, or the authorities, if any are still effectively functioning. In other instances, the dead are dragged from their homes by grieving, terrified relatives, or simply by those assigned the grim task and left in the narrow streets, awaiting collection. Makeshift morgues might be designated in empty buildings or churchyards, quickly overflowing. The established cemeteries, those carefully tended plots surrounding your parish church, are swamped almost immediately. There simply isn't enough consecrated ground, nor enough able-bodied sextons or gravediggers to provide individual burials for the hundreds, sometimes thousands, perishing daily in the larger urban centers. Medieval town councils, if they were still functioning, suddenly found themselves thrust into the high-volume, no-frills corpse disposal business. Another cartload, you say? Just stack 'em by the north wall next to the others. We'll try to get another pit dug after lunch, assuming anyone's still around to dig it. This overwhelming tide of mortality leads to a profound and painful breakdown of the traditional burial rituals that are so deeply woven into the fabric of your medieval Christian society. Normally, death, while a sorrowful event, is attended by a rich tapestry of communal and religious rites. The dying person would receive last rites from a priest, confess their sins, and prepare their soul for the afterlife. After death, the family would wash and shroud the body, often keeping a vigil with prayers and mourning. A requiem mass would be sung, and a procession of mourners would accompany the coffin to the churchyard for burial in an individual grave, often within earshot of the church bells, a sacred space promising resurrection. These rituals provided comfort, structure, and a sense of spiritual continuity. But during the plague, all of this collapses. Priests themselves are dying at an alarming rate, or are too overwhelmed or too fearful to attend every deathbed. Families terrified of contagion might flee from their own dying relatives. There's no time for wakes, no resources for individual coffins, no space for individual graves. The dignity of death, the solace of familiar custom, is brutally stripped away. This inability to properly mourn, to honor your loved ones according to the sacred traditions, adds another layer of profound psychological trauma for the survivors. And so, the era of the plague pit begins. This is a stark and unavoidable mainstream historical fact of the Black Death.
As churchyards overflowed, authorities were forced to find new, often unconsecrated ground outside the town walls or utilize any large open spaces within to dispose of the dead en masse. Huge, deep trenches would be excavated, and into these the bodies were brought, often by the wagon load. Giovanni Boccaccio, describing the scene in Florence, famously wrote that the dead were layered in these pits just as one lays layers of cheese and macaroni in a lasagna. It's a shockingly domestic and culinary simile for such a horrifying reality, but it conveys the grim efficiency and the sheer volume of the task. Day after day, more layers of bodies would be added, perhaps with a thin sprinkling of earth between them, until the pit was full. There was little ceremony, often no individual identification, just the anonymous communal internment of hundreds, even thousands of souls. The plague pits were less rest in peace and more packed in like sardines. At least, one might grimly jest, you weren't lonely in your final undignified resting place. Who then undertook the gruesome and dangerous task of collecting these bodies and transporting them to these mass graves? This work fell to individuals who became known by various names: Beccamorti in Italy, corpse bearers or ravens in other regions. These were often people from the poorest and most marginalized segments of society, those who had little else to lose. Sometimes they were individuals who had already contracted the plague and survived, and were therefore believed, often mistakenly, to be immune. In some cases, as a quirky and rather telling tidbit about the desperation of the times, authorities offered surprisingly high wages or even pardons for criminals to persuade people to take on this reviled but essential job. The cry of "Bring out your dead," echoing through the deserted, terrified streets, heralding the arrival of the death cart, became one of the most chilling and iconic sounds of the plague years. The job of Beccamorto wasn't exactly on anyone's childhood dream career list, that's for sure. But hey, it came with a perverse kind of job security. Lots of openings, you might say, with a shudder. These corpse collectors, often shunned and feared themselves as carriers of disease or simply as ill omens, performed a vital, if horrific, service, clearing the dead from homes and streets, preventing an even greater public health catastrophe from the buildup of decomposing remains.
Civic authorities, where they hadn't entirely collapsed, did make attempts to manage the crisis. Edicts were issued regarding the speedy burial of the dead. New burial grounds had to be hastily designated and consecrated if possible. Records from some towns show payments being made for the digging of pits and the collection of bodies. But these efforts were often overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the disaster. In some places, the fear of being buried alive in the haste and chaos was a very real concern. There are accounts of people, on falling ill, desperately pleading with their families to ensure they were truly dead before burial, perhaps by requesting a waiting period or for certain signs of life to be checked. The popular fear of premature burial, already present in medieval society, was undoubtedly amplified. If I start snoring in my coffin, please, for the love of God, dig me back up, you might imagine someone pleading. It's not a miracle, I'm just having a really, really bad nap. The atmosphere in a plague-stricken town or city would become one of almost unbearable somberness and silence, punctuated by the sounds of wailing, the rumble of the death carts, and perhaps the tolling of a church bell, if there was anyone left or brave enough to ring it. The usual vibrant sounds of medieval urban life, the chatter of the marketplace, the songs of artisans at their work, the laughter of children playing in the streets, the barking of dogs, the general hum of activity, would fade away, replaced by an eerie quiet, a silence that wasn't golden, but terrifying. It was a silence that spoke of emptied houses, abandoned workshops, and a population cowering in fear or already silenced forever. The official perfume of many plague-stricken towns, if such a thing could be bottled, would undoubtedly have been Ode to Despair and Profound Decomposition. Not a big seller on the medieval Etsy, surprisingly. The constant presence of death reshaped public spaces and daily routines. Streets that were once thoroughfares of commerce and community became deserted pathways, conduits for the dead. Familiar faces disappeared daily. The psychological toll of living in such an environment, surrounded by death, grieving multiple losses simultaneously, and facing your own mortality with such stark immediacy, is almost impossible for us to fully comprehend. This leads to an ongoing archaeological and historical debate. Archaeologists and historians still discuss the exact extent and nature of these plague pits across the entirety of Europe. While some large, well-documented pits have been excavated, such as the one at East Smithfield in London, which yielded invaluable skeletal evidence, the archaeological footprint of mass burials in many smaller towns or more remote rural areas is less clear. This raises questions about how consistently this practice of large, organized pits was adopted versus other forms of hasty interment in existing cemeteries, the use of multiple smaller pits, or even, in the most extreme and chaotic situations, the simple abandonment of bodies in deserted areas. The methods likely varied considerably, depending on local conditions, the severity of the outbreak, and the resilience of local social structures. What is certain is that the task of managing the dead was a defining experience of the Black Death. It stripped away ceremony, exposed the fragility of human institutions, and left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of the survivors. The carts piled high with bodies, the yarning pits, and the somber silence of depopulated landscapes became the enduring, nightmarish images of a world turned upside down by an invisible foe.
The carts have finally stopped their grim rounds. The last plague pits have been covered over, and a somber, echoing silence has fallen upon the land where once there was the cacophony of bustling life. You, as one of the fortunate, or perhaps simply resilient, survivors of this unparalleled catastrophe, now stand blinking in the eerie calm after the storm. But the world you knew, the meticulously ordered medieval society we explored in the beginning, has been irrevocably fractured, not just emotionally and spiritually, but in its very economic foundations. The Black Death, in its indiscriminate reaping, didn't just take lives, it fundamentally reshaped the relationship between land, labor, and wealth. The fields are indeed empty in many places, but from this emptiness, new, and for some surprisingly empowering, demands begin to arise. First, let's just briefly reabsorb the sheer scale of the demographic devastation. Across Europe, historians estimate that anywhere from 30% to an almost incomprehensible 60% of the entire population perished between 1347 and 1351. In some regions, villages were entirely wiped out, becoming ghost settlements reclaimed by weeds and wildflowers. In others, towns saw their populations halved or worse. This wasn't just a thinning of the ranks, it was a cataclysmic hemorrhage of human life. The immediate economic impact was, as you can imagine, chaotic. Vast swaths of agricultural land lay fallow, untended, because the hands that once tilled them were cold. Livestock wandered unfed or were lost to predators because the shepherds and herders were gone. Workshops stood silent, their master craftsmen and apprentices alike victims of the pestilence. Trade routes, both local and international, were severely disrupted, not only because traders and sailors had died, but because fear of the plague brought commerce to a standstill in many areas. The very pulse of economic life seemed to falter. But from this devastation, an unexpected consequence began to emerge, a consequence that would have profound implications for the social order. With so many dead, the most fundamental economic equation had been turned on its head. Land, which had once been scarce and precious, was now relatively plentiful, while labor, which had once been abundant and cheap, was suddenly in desperately short supply. And if you were one of the surviving peasants, one of the farm laborers or village artisans who made up the backbone of the medieval economy, this new reality slowly began to dawn on you. Suddenly, your skills, your strength, your sheer ability to work were more valuable than ever before. Suddenly, you found yourself in a position to make demands. It was a bit like musical chairs, but instead of chairs, it was jobs, and a good half of the players had just vanished.
Suddenly, being a peasant wasn't quite the terrible, inescapable gig it used to be. You want this field plowed, my lord? You might find yourself thinking, or even daring to say, well, the old rate just isn't going to cut it. That'll be double, if you please, plus perhaps a bit of that better ale you keep for yourself, and I'm thinking Wednesdays off might be nice for, quiet contemplation of my remarkably improved bargaining position and the general fragility of existence. This newfound leverage for the working classes is a crucial mainstream historical fact of the post-plague era. Surviving laborers, both agricultural and urban, began to demand and often receive significantly higher wages. They sought better working conditions, more food, and greater freedom to move from one manor or town to another in search of the best terms. If one lord refused their demands, another, desperate for workers to bring in his harvest or tend his sheep, might well concede. This mobility was a radical departure from the often hereditary bonds of serfdom that had tied peasants to their lord's land for generations. The nobles were, as you might imagine, rather put out by this turn of events. What in tarnation do you mean the peasants want actual money for their work? And rights? And freedom to leave whenever they fancy? This wasn't in the feudalism brochure we all signed up for. In agriculture, the impact was transformative. With fewer hands to work the land, patterns of land use began to shift. Labor-intensive arable farming, the growing of grain crops like wheat and barley, became less viable in some areas. Instead, landowners increasingly turned to pastoral farming, particularly raising sheep, which required far fewer workers per acre and offered profitable returns from wool, a key medieval export. So fields that once waved with golden wheat were now dotted with fluffy, four-legged lawnmowers. Less work, more wool, and sheep, bless their simple hearts, rarely demand better working conditions or paid holidays. A win-win for some landowners, though perhaps not for those who relied on cheap bread. Land holdings also began to be consolidated. With entire peasant families wiped out, their plots often reverted to the lord or were taken over by surviving, more prosperous peasants. For some fortunate survivors in the peasant class, this was an unprecedented opportunity to acquire more land, to improve their holdings, and to climb a rung or two on the economic ladder. The traditional manorial system, with its rigid obligations and servile labor, began to crumble, particularly in Western Europe. Serfdom didn't vanish overnight, but the Black Death dealt it a mortal blow, accelerating its decline by decades, if not centuries.
The ruling classes, the nobility and wealthy landowners, did not take these changes lying down, of course. Faced with plummeting rental incomes from their depopulated lands and soaring labor costs, they attempted to push back. Across Europe, governments enacted legislation aimed at controlling wages and restricting the movement of laborers, trying to force the clock back to the pre-plague status quo. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, and the Statute of Labourers, 1351, famously attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and compel all able-bodied men and women to work for whoever required their labor at the old rates. Similar laws were passed in France, Castile, and other kingdoms. The Statute of Labourers was essentially the medieval equivalent of a very sternly worded, all-caps email from upper management decreeing, "Attention all peasants, cease and desist asking for raises immediately. Return to your assigned misery. That is all." It worked about as well as those kinds of emails usually do, which is to say, not very effectively in the long run. Labor was simply too scarce and the economic pressures too strong for such legislation to be consistently enforced or obeyed. Workers continued to demand, and often get, better terms, or they simply voted with their feet and moved elsewhere. The urban economy also experienced significant shifts. Guilds, which regulated craft production in towns, were impacted by the loss of masters and apprentices. Some guilds weakened, while others adapted, perhaps by making it easier for new members to join or by diversifying their production. The demand for certain goods changed. With so many deaths, a great deal of wealth was inherited by survivors, sometimes leading to increased demand for luxury goods among those who suddenly found themselves better off. Some peasants, as a quirky tidbit, found themselves so unexpectedly prosperous after the plague, with more land and higher income from their labor or produce, that they began to enjoy a significantly higher standard of living than they or their ancestors could ever have imagined. There are records of them demanding better quality food, more meat, and stronger ale from their employers or in the marketplace. Some even began to wear finer clothes, much to the chagrin of the social elites. You might even see a particularly well-off peasant sporting shoes, on both feet no less, the absolute scandal of it. This sometimes led to the reinforcement or new enactment of sumptuary laws, which were designed to regulate what different social classes could wear or consume, partly as an attempt by the nobility to maintain visible class distinctions in a world where economic realities were blurring those lines. The broader economic effects were complex. In the immediate aftermath, with mass demand collapsing due to mass mortality, prices for some goods, particularly agricultural products, may have fallen in some areas. However, the scarcity of labor soon put upward pressure on wages, which in turn could contribute to inflationary trends for manufactured goods or services. The value of land generally decreased as there was so much of it available and fewer people to work it or rent it. This was a world turned upside down. Labor became dear, land became cheap. The plague, in its grim way, really did manage to shake up the traditional social and economic ladder. Some people went from serfs up and toiling in muddy fields to sirs up and owning their own patch of land, or at least commanding a much better wage, in a surprisingly short amount of time. This period of economic readjustment was not smooth or without conflict. The attempts by the nobility to reimpose old controls and the rising expectations of the peasantry and urban workers led to increased social tensions and, in some cases, outright revolts in the decades that followed, such as the Jacquerie in France, 1358, and the Peasants' Revolt in England, 1381. This leads to an important open scholarly debate. Historians still debate the precise speed and regional variations of the decline of serfdom after the Black Death. While the pandemic undoubtedly accelerated the process significantly in Western Europe, the extent to which direct peasant agency, through resistance, flight, and organized revolts, versus purely impersonal economic market forces, primarily labor scarcity, was the main driver of this emancipation, is a complex issue with differing interpretations and regional nuances. What is clear is that the empty fields left by the plague created not just desolation, but also unforeseen opportunities and demands, fundamentally altering the economic landscape of medieval Europe and setting the stage for profound social changes yet to come.
The empty fields we spoke of, now perhaps slowly returning to cultivation or given over to grazing sheep, and the newfound, if contentious, demands of a diminished labor force, these are the tangible, economic scars left by the Black Death. But the plague's impact cut far deeper than the purse and the plow. It burrowed into the very psyche of European society, shaking the foundations of faith, darkening artistic palettes, and fundamentally altering the way you, as a survivor, perceived life, death, and the world around you. The sheer, unblinking horror of what you've witnessed, the mountains of dead, the futility of prayers, the collapse of order, inevitably leaves an indelible mark on the collective soul. Let's first consider your faith, that bedrock of medieval existence. Before the plague, the Church was an omnipresent, unquestioned authority, its doctrines the lens through which almost all life was interpreted. But the pestilence put this faith through an agonizing trial by fire. For some, undoubtedly, the horror drove them to an even more fervent piety. You might have seen neighbors, having lost everything, cling even more desperately to prayer, to the promise of an afterlife where such suffering would cease. Donations to churches, the founding of chantry chapels where priests would say masses for the souls of the dead, especially the testators, and acts of public penance all saw an upsurge in some quarters. If God was angry, then surely more fervent devotion was the answer. However, for many others, the experience was profoundly disillusioning. You would have heard the desperate questions whispered, then perhaps spoken aloud. Why did God allow such indiscriminate slaughter? Why did the prayers of the righteous go unanswered, while scoundrels sometimes survived? Why did so many dedicated priests and monks, those supposedly closest to God, perish at such high rates, often while ministering to the sick, while some venal or cowardly clerics fled their posts and lived?
people started asking some pretty tough questions. "Dear God, what exactly gives here?" they might have wondered. The celestial customer service line, it seemed, was either permanently busy or offering no satisfactory explanations. This questioning didn't necessarily mean a wholesale abandonment of Christianity that was almost unthinkable in your world, but it could lead to a shift in how faith was expressed and understood. Criticism of the church as an institution, already simmering before the plague due to issues like its immense wealth, the perceived corruption or laxity of some clergy, and the political machinations of the papacy, then based in Avignon, certainly intensified. The church's inability to provide effective spiritual solace or, crucially, any real physical protection or cure against the plague damaged its prestige and authority in the eyes of many. Some priests, as you'd have observed, were true heroes, staying with their flock to the bitter end. Others, well, let's just say their working from remote locations policy often involved a different town, or even a different country, preferably one not currently experiencing apocalyptic levels of death. This disillusionment with institutional religion may have contributed to a rise in lay piety and forms of mysticism. People sought a more personal, direct connection with God, one less reliant on the formal structures and intermediaries of the church. Movements like the Devotio Moderna, modern devotion, which emphasized individual spiritual growth and imitation of Christ, began to gain traction in the later 14th and 15th centuries, its roots arguably fed by the spiritual anxieties of the plague era. Figures like Julian of Norwich in England, who lived through the plague, and wrote of her mystical visions offering a message of hope and divine love amidst suffering, represent this intensely personal and experiential approach to faith. Monasteries, too, were hit incredibly hard by the plague, with some losing the vast majority of their monks. This not only disrupted their spiritual and economic life, but also their role as centers of learning and charity. Your whole worldview, the lens through which you see your place in the cosmos, would have been profoundly altered. The sheer fragility of life, the terrifying immediacy of death, became the dominant reality. Before the plague, while death was common, it was usually an individual or familial event attended by familiar rituals. Now, you've seen death on an industrial, impersonal scale. This could lead to a kind of fatalism, a sense that human endeavor was ultimately meaningless in the face of such overwhelming forces. Alternatively, for some, it fostered a seize-the-day mentality, a desperate urge to experience what little pleasure or meaning life might still offer before it was snatched away. Attitudes towards authority, both secular and religious, also began to shift. When lords couldn't protect you and priests couldn't save you, the old certainties about the social order started to erode. And how was all this trauma, this profound shift in consciousness, reflected in the culture around you, particularly in art and literature? This is where the darkening becomes most visible. The Black Death unleashed a torrent of macabre imagery, a preoccupation with mortality and the transience of earthly achievements that is a key mainstream historical fact of the period. Medieval art, already concerned with religious themes, got real dark real fast. Suddenly, it wasn't all serene Madonnas and cherubic angels. It was increasingly more like skeletons having a surprisingly energetic disco with the Pope and the Emperor. Edgy stuff for the 14th century.
The most famous artistic motif to emerge from this era is the dance macabre, or dance of death. Imagine frescoes painted on church walls or cemetery cloisters, or woodcuts printed in books depicting a procession of skeletons, personifications of death, gleefully leading away people from all walks of life. A greeting skeleton takes the hand of a king in his ermine robes, another waltzes with a finely dressed lady, a third drags along a reluctant peasant, a merchant, a child, and even a pope or a cardinal. The message was stark and unavoidable. Death is the ultimate equalizer. It comes for everyone, regardless of wealth, power, or piety. The dance of death was the ultimate conga line, and participation was strictly mandatory. This theme served as a powerful memento mori, a reminder of your own mortality, urging you to prepare your soul. Similar in spirit was the triumph of death imagery, often vast, terrifying paintings showing death as a skeletal figure on a pale horse, scything down multitudes, or as a horrifying hag reaping her harvest of souls. Another significant development was the ars moriendi, or the art of dying well. These were illustrated manuscripts and later printed books that provided guidance on how to face death in a good Christian manner, detailing the temptations one might face on one's deathbed, like despair, impatience, or pride, and the spiritual remedies to overcome them. They literally wrote guidebooks on how to die a good death. Step 1, try really hard not to get the plague in the first place. Step 2, if you do, try not to panic too much when you see the Grim Reaper peeking around your bed curtains. Easier said than done, one imagines. Even tomb sculpture changed. The serene effigies of knights and ladies atop their tombs began to be supplemented or replaced by transy tombs, which featured a gruesome, realistic depiction of the deceased's decaying corpse, often shrouded and worm-eaten, lying beneath a more conventional effigy of them in life. This stark reminder of physical decay was meant to emphasize the vanity of worldly concerns. Literary responses also reflected the trauma. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, while famous for its often body and life-affirming tales, is framed by a vivid description of plague-ravaged Florence, with 10 young people fleeing to the countryside to escape the pestilence by telling stories. Petrarch, the great Italian poet and humanist, lost many friends and loved ones, including his beloved Laura, to the plague. And his writings are suffused with a profound sense of loss and reflections on mortality. In England, William Langland's allegorical poem Piers Plowman, while addressing broader social and religious issues, was written in the shadow of the plague and its recurrences, and it powerfully depicts a society in crisis. Religious practices, too, adapted and intensified in specific ways. The veneration of saints believed to offer protection against plague soared. Saint Roch, for example, who supposedly contracted the plague himself while ministering to others and was miraculously healed with the help of a dog that brought him bread, became hugely popular. Saint Sebastian, an early Christian martyr, often depicted pierced with arrows, which, as we mentioned, were sometimes seen as symbols of plague, also saw his cult flourish. Pilgrimages to their shrines or to other holy sites became more common, despite the dangers of travel, as people sought divine intercession. The flagellant movement, which we've already discussed in the context of scapegoating, was also, at its core, an extreme religious response, an attempt to atone and appease God. There was also a heightened focus on purgatory, that intermediate state where souls were purified before entering heaven, and a corresponding boom in the endowment of prayers and masses for the dead. Here's a quirky tidbit. Post-plague wills often show an almost obsessive concern with ensuring that an elaborate and often mind-bogglingly frequent schedule of masses would be said for the testator's soul, sometimes for decades after their death. This reflected a deep anxiety about the fate of one's soul in the afterlife, amplified by the horrors they had witnessed and the suddenness with which death could strike. The sudden appearance or increased prominence of new chapels or altars dedicated to previously minor saints who were now elevated to the status of plague saints also attests to this shifting spiritual landscape. This leads to a fascinating open scholarly debate. Historians and art historians continue to discuss whether the dominant cultural response to the Black Death was one of pervasive pessimism, morbidity, and a definitive darkening of the European psyche, or if, alongside the undeniable trauma and the obsession with death, there were also countervailing currents. Did the experience also foster an intensified piety in many, a renewed appreciation for the preciousness of life, and perhaps even sow the seeds of the intellectual curiosity and artistic innovation that would characterize the later Renaissance? Post-plague, you certainly had two distinct moods available on any given day. Life is short and probably going to end horribly, so let's commission a really gloomy painting about it. Or, life is short, the ale is surprisingly cheap now, let's party. The truth is likely that both existed, often side by side, reflecting the complex and contradictory ways human beings grapple with catastrophe. The faith of Europe was undeniably shaken, its art undeniably darkened. But from these shadows, new forms of expression and new ways of understanding the world were also beginning, ever so slowly, to emerge.
The profound cultural shifts, the shaken faith, and the darkened art we just explored, these were not responses to a single isolated catastrophe that then faded into memory. Oh no, If only it were that simple. You see, the Black Death of 1347 to 1351, that initial devastating wave, was merely the opening act of a much longer, grimmer drama. The plague, having found a new and tragically welcoming home in Europe, decided to stick around. Its shadow would linger not just for a few years, but for centuries, returning with dreadful regularity to remind humanity of its fragility. Understanding this recurring horror is key to understanding the long-term transformation of your world. The plague was like that truly terrible house guest who, after an initial visit of unimaginable destruction, keeps showing up unannounced every few years, raiding the pantry, terrifying the children, and generally making life miserable. "Oh, you thought I was gone for good?" it seemed to sneer. "Surprise! I'm back for another season of boils, mass hysteria, and an exciting new range of public health regulations." After the first great pandemic subsided in the early 1350s, Yersinia pestis didn't simply vanish from European soil. While there's some debate among scientists whether it established truly permanent reservoirs in European rodent populations or was repeatedly reintroduced from endemic areas in Asia, the practical result was the same: recurrent outbreaks. This became known as the Second Plague Pandemic. These later epidemics might strike a kingdom, a region, or just a handful of towns, often with less apocalyptic overall mortality than the initial onslaught, but they were still terrifying and deadly enough to cause significant disruption and maintain a pervasive undercurrent of fear in society. Imagine living your life knowing that every decade or so, every generation, the great sickness might return to your community. It would inevitably shape your worldview, your willingness to make long-term plans, even your daily habits. Children would grow up hearing stories of the last outbreak, a bogeyman that wasn't mythical, but a very real, recurring threat. And it returned. There was the pestis secunda in the 1360s, which seemed particularly fatal to children, sometimes called the Plague of Children. Then further outbreaks in the 1370s, 1380s, and so on, a grim drumbeat throughout the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. Some of these later waves were particularly infamous in their own right. Think of the devastating Italian plague of 1629 to 1631, which ravaged cities like Milan and Venice. Or the Great Plague of Seville in Spain, which in 1647 to 1652 claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. England had its own horrors, culminating in the Great Plague of London in 1665 to 1666, vividly chronicled by Samuel Pepys and Daniel Defoe, where an estimated 100,000 people, perhaps a quarter of the city's population, perished. Vienna suffered a major outbreak in 1679, and one of the last major appearances in Western Europe was the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720, a stark reminder that even in the Age of Enlightenment, this medieval terror could still return with a vengeance. These later outbreaks, while horrific for those who experienced them, sometimes had lower overall mortality rates than the 1347 to 51 cataclysm. This might have been due to a degree of acquired immunity in the population, slightly less virulent strains of the bacterium, or crucially, the slow and painful development of societal responses and public health measures. This brings us to a critical development. Humanity, faced with this persistent, recurring enemy, began, ever so slowly and imperfectly, to fight back in an organized fashion. This is a mainstream historical fact. The repeated experience of plague spurred the gradual invention of public health as a concept and practice. The Italian city-states, with their extensive maritime trade and dense urban populations, were often the first to suffer, and thus the first to innovate. As early as 1377, the city-state of Ragusa, now Dubrovnik in Croatia, then under Venetian influence, issued a decree that all travelers and goods arriving from plague-stricken areas had to spend 30 days, a trentine, in an isolated spot outside the city before being allowed entry. This period was later extended to 40 days, or quarantena, in Italian, the origin of our word quarantine. The idea was simple. If you were going to get sick, you'd likely do so during this isolation period, thus preventing the disease from entering the city proper. The invention of quarantine was basically Italy saying,
Look, your ship and your crew look just a little bit plaguey to us. No offense. Why don't you just hang out on that rather bleak, deserted island over there for, say, 40 days? Enjoy the sea breeze. If you're all still alive and not covered in suspicious boils after that, we'll talk about letting you in. Venice, another major maritime power, developed a highly sophisticated quarantine system, establishing isolated islands like the Lazaretto Vecchio, Old Lazaretto, founded in 1423, and later the Lazaretto Nuovo, New Lazaretto, as plague hospitals and quarantine stations. These lazarettos were specifically for isolating individuals suspected of having the plague or those arriving from infected areas. They weren't really places of cure, medicine still had little to offer, but rather of containment. Conditions in these lazarettos were often grim, but they represented a systematic attempt to separate the sick from the healthy. Lazarettos, where you went to get away from it all, especially if it all was the actual plague, and to get away meant be compulsorily isolated with a large number of other plague sufferers and a distinct lack of amenities. Five-star misery, perhaps, but a step towards organized public response.
Many Italian cities, and later those in other parts of Europe, established health magistrates or boards of health, permanent bodies of officials tasked with preventing and managing plague outbreaks. These were the medieval no-fun police, but with life-or-death responsibilities. When plague threatened or arrived, they could be granted extraordinary powers. They would order street cleaning and the removal of filth, still based on miasma theory, but with some practical benefits. They could ban public gatherings like fairs, festivals, and even church services to prevent people from congregating. They regulated the movement of people and goods, often requiring travelers to carry fedi di sanità, health passes or certificates testifying that they came from a plague-free area. Your medieval health pass was essentially a document stating, "This certifies that the bearer, Bartholomew Buttercup, did not look too obviously plague-ridden when he left the last town he was in. We make no guarantees about his current status or the fleas in his hat. Good luck to you next town." Confidence-inspiring, I'm sure. These health boards also organized the removal and burial of the dead, the disinfection of contaminated houses and belongings, often by fumigation with sulfur or aromatic herbs, or by washing with vinegar, and the provision of food to quarantined areas. Sometimes this included the grim practice of shutting in houses. If a single member of a household was diagnosed with plague, the entire house would be sealed by the authorities, sick and healthy alike, locked inside together for weeks, often with a watchman posted outside to prevent anyone from escaping. This was essentially a death sentence for many of the healthy individuals trapped within, but it was seen as a necessary evil to protect the wider community. A quirky tidbit from some later plague periods, particularly in England, was the appointment of searchers of the dead. These were often elderly women, sometimes considered expendable or believed to have some immunity, whose official job was to inspect corpses to determine the cause of death and report suspected plague cases to the authorities. The job title Searchers of the Dead sounds like a fantastic name for a gothic metal band, but in grim reality, it was probably one of the worst, most dangerous, and least respected gigs imaginable. Yep, that's definitely a plague boil. Next. They also contributed to the bills of mortality published in cities like London, which were early attempts at public health statistics, listing the number of deaths and, supposedly, their causes, including the plague. Over the centuries, medical advice in plague treatises also evolved, albeit slowly. While still generally operating within the miasma humoral framework, physicians gained more practical experience. They began to recognize patterns, to differentiate plague from other fevers with more accuracy, and to refine their, still largely ineffective, treatments and preventative advice. There was a greater emphasis on isolation of the sick, on cleanliness, and on the management of outbreaks by civic authorities. Society also adapted in myriad small ways. Perhaps there was more attention paid to personal cleanliness or subtle shifts in architecture towards materials less hospitable to rats, like brick and stone instead of timber and thatch, though these were very long-term trends driven by many factors. Fear of contagion certainly lingered, influencing social interactions, travel decisions, and even the handling of mail and goods, which might be smoked or treated with vinegar. Imagine getting a letter from your dear aunt and it smells like a bonfire and a pickle factory combined. That's just love and diligent plague prevention, medieval to early modern style. So, why did the plague eventually loosen its grip on Europe?
The last major outbreak in Western Europe was in Marseille in 1720, though it continued in Eastern Europe and other parts of the world for much longer. This brings us to another fascinating open scholarly debate. Scientists and historians vigorously discuss the precise reasons for this decline. There's no single universally accepted answer. One popular theory is the ecological shift in rat populations. The aggressive brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, which tends to live more separately from humans, e.g. in sewers rather than in houses, began to displace the black rat, Rattus rattus, the more common house-dwelling rat during the medieval period, and a preferred host for plague-carrying fleas. Other factors likely included gradual improvements in housing materials, more stone and brick, less wood and thatch, offering fewer nesting places for rats, better sanitation and waste disposal in cities, a very slow process, increased human immunity after centuries of exposure, and, importantly, the increasing effectiveness of quarantine and other public health measures, which, while not always perfectly enforced or understood, did help to contain outbreaks and prevent widespread pandemics. It's also possible that the Yersinia pestis bacterium itself evolved to become less virulent over time. When the plague finally, mostly, packed its bags and left Western Europe after the early 18th century, everyone was probably like, "Don't let the portcullis hit you on the way out." And then they likely immediately started arguing about why it had left, a debate that continues to this day. But the centuries of its lingering shadow had forever changed the face of Europe, forcing it to develop new ways of confronting epidemic disease, lessons learned at an almost unimaginable cost.
The lingering shadow of the plague, that recurring nightmare we've just walked through, eventually began to recede from Western Europe by the early 18th century. But the world it left behind was not the same one it had found in 1347. The centuries of epidemic disease, starting with that first cataclysmic wave, had acted as a grim, relentless sculptor, carving new contours into the demographic, economic, social, political, and even the psychological landscape of the continent. You, looking back from a vantage point of relative safety, can now begin to appreciate the sheer scale of these transformations. The Black Death and its subsequent visitations didn't just cause immense suffering, they irrevocably altered the trajectory of European history. Let's start with the most fundamental change, the people themselves. Europe's population, as we noted, may have plummeted by as much as 30 to 60% in that first terrible outbreak. Recovering from such a demographic catastrophe was a slow, arduous process, taking centuries, not decades. In some regions, it wasn't until the 16th or even 17th century that population levels returned to what they had been before 1347. Europe's population recovery was like the world's longest and most depressing group project, with the sole aim being to just make more people, please. This prolonged period of reduced population density had far-reaching effects. Entire villages, particularly in marginal agricultural areas, were abandoned and never reoccupied, their fields reverting to pasture or woodland, their stone foundations slowly swallowed by the earth. Other, more fertile or strategically located settlements might have seen their populations eventually recover and even grow, leading to shifts in the overall pattern of human habitation. Family structures also changed. With so many deaths, patterns of marriage, inheritance, and land transfer were disrupted. People might marry younger, or widows and widowers remarry more quickly. Inheritance laws and customs were tested as entire family lines were extinguished, leading to disputes, but also opportunities for distant relatives or even unrelated individuals to acquire property. Economically, the transformations were equally profound, as we began to explore. The chronic labor shortages that followed the initial plague wave and persisted through subsequent outbreaks fundamentally altered the balance of power between employers and workers. In agriculture, the scarcity of peasants meant that surviving laborers could demand, and often receive, significantly higher wages, better conditions, and greater personal freedom. This accelerated the decline of serfdom and the manorial system in Western Europe. Feudalism after the plague was like a knight whose armor was riddled with holes and kept clanking off at inopportune moments. It was still sort of present, of familiar outline, but it wasn't really doing its old job effectively anymore. Landlords, faced with reduced rental incomes and higher labor costs, had to adapt. Many shifted from labor-intensive arable farming, growing grain, to less labor-intensive pastoral farming, particularly sheep rearing, which supplied the lucrative wool trade. Others were forced to offer more favorable terms to attract tenants, such as converting customary dues into fixed cash rents or granting longer leases. For surviving peasants, this could mean access to more land, greater security of tenure, and an improved standard of living. Thanks to the plague, your average resourceful farmhand, let's call him Bartholomew, might suddenly find himself able to afford not just basic necessities, but perhaps a slightly nicer hat, or even, dare we say it, shoes for both feet. The local nobility probably clutched their pearls and muttered about the good old days when peasants knew their place. This economic restructuring wasn't limited to the countryside. In towns, guilds faced a loss of skilled craftsmen and had to adjust their apprenticeship rules. The nature of demand for goods also shifted. While overall demand might have fallen with the population, survivors who inherited wealth from deceased relatives might have had more disposable income, potentially increasing the market for certain types of goods, including some modest luxuries. The higher labor costs also arguably provided an impetus for technological innovation in some sectors, as employers sought labor-saving devices, though the extent and speed of this is the subject of ongoing historical discussion. What is clearer is that the post-plague economy became in many ways more dynamic and commercialized. These economic shifts fueled significant social restructuring and increased social mobility, at least for some. The traditional medieval social hierarchy, with its fairly rigid divisions between nobility, clergy, and peasantry, became more fluid. The economic woes of the landowning aristocracy, coupled with the rising fortunes of some peasants and artisans, began to blur the old lines. As we mentioned, sumptuary laws were often enacted or reinforced, attempting to dictate what different classes could wear, a clear sign that those lines were indeed being challenged by people dressing above their station. The recurring plague outbreaks and the associated social and economic stresses also contributed to a climate of unrest. Peasant revolts like the Jacquerie in France in 1358 or the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, while having multiple complex causes, were certainly fueled by the new expectations and grievances of a peasantry that was increasingly unwilling to accept the reimposition of old feudal obligations in a world where their labor was so clearly valuable. The status and roles of women also saw some changes, albeit often temporary. With severe labor shortages, women in some areas found new opportunities in agriculture, crafts, and commerce, sometimes taking over businesses left by deceased husbands or fathers.
Politically, the Black Death and its aftermath had a mixed but significant impact. The authority of some local lords and nobles was undoubtedly weakened by their economic difficulties and their inability to control their labor force or protect their populace from the ravages of disease. In contrast, the power of monarchies and more centralized states sometimes grow. Kings and their governments increasingly took on roles related to public health, such as coordinating responses to plague outbreaks, enacting national labor laws like the Statute of Laborers, and attempting to maintain order. The development of public health infrastructure, rudimentary as it was, with health boards, quarantine regulations, and plague hospitals, laid some of the earliest foundations for the modern interventionist state. Warfare itself was affected. With smaller populations, recruiting large armies became more challenging, potentially influencing military strategies and the nature of conflict in the later Middle Ages. Religiously and intellectually, the repercussions continued to ripple outwards for centuries. As we discussed, the Church's authority and prestige suffered due to its inability to explain or alleviate the plague, the high mortality among its clergy, and the perceived moral failings of some of its members. The Church's PR department probably had a tough few centuries after the initial plague waves. Their message was something along the lines of, God is love, but also, sometimes, he sends a continent-wide, multi-generational death sneeze that wipes out half the population. It's, complicated. Have you considered donating more? This disillusionment contributed to the growth of lay piety movements, mysticism, and a more critical attitude towards ecclesiastical institutions, which some historians argue helped create a fertile ground for the later challenges of the Protestant Reformation. A quirky tidbit from the ecclesiastical world, the massive death toll among clergy, particularly educated ones, created a crisis in recruitment. To fill vacant positions, standards for ordination were sometimes lowered, leading to the appointment of younger, less experienced, or even less scrupulous individuals, which further fueled criticism of the Church from contemporary reformers. However, the plague also spurred the founding of new colleges and universities, often with the specific aim of training a new generation of clergy and scholars to replace those who had been lost.
With so many established scholars gone, new ideas and different approaches sometimes found more room to breathe and circulate. It was an academic version of out with the old and tragically deceased, in with the slightly less old and possibly more innovative. This leads us to a major open scholarly debate. Historians continue to grapple with the extent to which the Black Death was a primary engine of change that directly caused the major transformations of the later Middle Ages and the dawn of the early modern period, such as the decline of feudalism, the rise of capitalism, the Renaissance, or the Reformation, versus being an accelerant of trends that were already underway, or simply one very significant factor among many in a complex web of historical causation. Was it the single great storm that reshaped the landscape, or did it merely hasten processes that were already slowly unfolding? There's no simple answer, and the impact varied significantly across different regions of Europe. What is undeniable is that Europe before the Black Death and Europe after were, in many fundamental ways, two different worlds. It was like watching a familiar TV show that after a dramatic mid-season event comes back with the same basic setting and many of the same character types, but the overall plot, the underlying mood, and certainly the audience ratings have been wildly and permanently altered. The psychological legacy of living with endemic plague for centuries, the heightened awareness of mortality, the search for meaning in a seemingly capricious world, the slow, painful steps towards understanding and combating epidemic disease, all this left an indelible imprint. The old certainties had been shattered, and while the path forward was often dark and uncertain, the world was, without doubt, irrevocably altered.
And so we find ourselves at the far end of this long, dark tunnel, having journeyed from the unsuspecting medieval world through the terrifying arrival and onslaught of the Black Death, witnessed its recurring shadow across centuries, and considered the profound ways it reshaped the very fabric of European society. The plague, in its most virulent epidemic form, eventually loosened its iron grip on Western Europe by the early 18th century, retreating into the annals of history, or so it largely seemed. But its echoes, the lessons learned and sometimes forgotten, the cultural scars and the societal shifts it initiated resonate even now, through the centuries, into our own time. As you lie there, on the cusp of sleep, it's worth reflecting for a few moments on these enduring reverberations. The most immediate and perhaps most tangible legacy lies in the realm of public health. That desperate, fumbling response to an unknown enemy, which we saw in the form of quarantine, isolation in lazarettos, and the establishment of health boards by Italian city-states, these were the embryonic beginnings of organized public health as we know it. This is a crucial mainstream historical fact. Born of terror and pragmatism, these measures, however imperfectly understood or enforced at the time, laid down fundamental principles of disease control, separation of the sick, observation of the potentially infected, and civic responsibility for communal well-being. Medieval quarantine, for example, with its arbitrary 40 days on a possibly rat-infested island, might seem a world away from modern medical isolation, but the underlying principle is strikingly similar. It was a case of, "Your ship looks a bit iffy, old bean. Why don't you just enjoy a prolonged, involuntary seaside holiday? If you're all still hale and hearty after that, we can talk business." Progress, medieval style. The Black Death also starkly highlighted the catastrophic consequences of not understanding disease transmission. Their miasma theory, their belief in corrupted air and unfavorable planetary alignments, while logical within their framework, sent them down entirely wrong paths for prevention and cure. The eventual, much later triumph of germ theory in the 19th century, the understanding that tiny living organisms cause infectious disease, was the true revolution that finally gave humanity effective tools against such pestilences. It makes you appreciate modern science, doesn't it? Imagine trying to fight a microscopic bacterial invader armed only with good intentions, a bouquet of sweet-smelling posies, and a firm belief that Tuesday afternoons were particularly miasmatic.
Thank goodness for scientists, who eventually figured out it wasn't just bad smells, but actual tiny, murderous germs doing the dirty work. And what of societal responses to overwhelming crises? Here, the parallels between the 14th century and later, even modern epidemics can be uncomfortably familiar. The fear and panic that gripped medieval communities, the flight from infected areas, the breakdown of social order in some places, these are not unique to a bygone era. Human psychology, it seems, has certain consistent reactions when faced with an invisible, lethal threat. The desperate search for scapegoats, the tragic blaming of Jewish communities for the Black Death finds its echoes in the stigmatization of other groups during subsequent health crises throughout history. Misinformation and rumor, which spread like wildfire in the 14th century, fueled by fear and a lack of reliable information, remain a challenge even in our age of instant communication. Back then, it was wild tales of bad air from angry planets or conspiracies to poison wells. Nowadays, it might be microchips in vaccines delivered by Bill Gates or 5G towers spreading viruses. Misinformation, much like fashion, simply gets recycled over the centuries with new, updated accessories. Yet alongside the darker aspects of human behavior, the Black Death also illuminated the brighter ones. We saw evidence of extraordinary altruism, of physicians and clergy who risked and lost their lives caring for the sick, of ordinary people who showed compassion and supported their communities. This spectrum of human response, from heroism to cowardice, from selflessness to exploitation, appears to be a timeless feature of any great calamity. The role of authorities, too, presents enduring lessons. The immense challenge of leadership in a crisis, the difficulty of maintaining public trust and order, the vital importance of providing clear guidance and material aid, and the constant tension between individual liberties and the demands of public safety.
Economically and socially, pandemics have a habit of acting as brutal magnifying glasses, exposing and often exacerbating pre-existing inequalities and societal fault lines. The Black Death certainly did this, but it also, as we saw, acted as a powerful, if indiscriminate, agent of change, leading to shifts in labor dynamics, land use, and social mobility. While we wouldn't wish for such a catalyst, it's a reminder that periods of profound crisis can, amidst the devastation, also create openings for significant societal restructuring. The resilience and adaptability of human societies, their ability to rebuild and find new ways forward even after unimaginable loss, is another powerful echo. If 14th century peasants living on the edge of subsistence could survive the plague, recurrent famines, questionable overlords, and truly appalling dental hygiene, then we, with our modern comforts and knowledge, can probably handle most things that come our way. Probably. The importance of memory, or indeed the peril of forgetting, is another key reflection. For generations after the Black Death, its memory was seared into the European consciousness, shaping art, literature, religious devotion, and social customs. A quirky tidbit underscoring this is how even centuries later, certain symbols or phrases associated with the plague retained a potent cultural charge. The image of the beaked plague doctor or the Red Cross marked on a door became instantly recognizable shorthand for pestilence and dread. Shakespeare's famous curse, "A plague on both your houses," from Romeo and Juliet, written over 200 years after the first outbreak, still carried the chilling weight of that collective trauma. These cultural memories served in part as warnings. Societies that actively remember and study past pandemics, that institutionalize the lessons learned, are arguably better prepared for future ones. This leads to an ongoing scholarly debate. Historians and sociologists continue to discuss how effectively societies truly learn from past pandemics. While historical events like the Black Death offer a veritable library of lessons regarding public health responses, the importance of social cohesion, and the potential for economic disruption, the extent to which these lessons are actively remembered, understood, and applied in subsequent crises is, shall we say, highly variable and often contested, particularly when comparing pre-modern anxieties with modern complacency or overconfidence.
Humanity's ability to learn from historical pandemics sometimes seems like my personal ability to stick to a New Year's resolution. It's well-intentioned, occasionally successful for a brief period, but then someone brings out the metaphorical cake, or a novel virus emerges from somewhere unexpected. Ultimately, the story of the Black Death, for all its unrelenting horror, is also a story of human endurance. Despite the terror, the immense loss, and the centuries of recurring fear, European society did not collapse entirely. It adapted, it changed, it rebuilt. It slowly, painstakingly developed new tools, social, medical, governmental, to cope with an existential threat. The Black Death may be long gone from the headlines of Western Europe, but its echoes are still subtly present in our public health systems, in our cultural memory of disease, and in our understanding of how societies respond to profound crisis. It's a somber reminder of our shared vulnerability, but also of our enduring capacity for resilience, innovation, and, amidst the darkness, compassion. It's a chapter of our collective human story that, even in its bleakness, offers profound insights, if we only choose to listen to its faint, lingering whispers as we drift towards sleep.
And so, as our journey through the shadowed valleys of the Black Death comes to a close, allow the images to soften, the stark details to fade into the gentle quiet of your room. The clatter of the death carts, the lamentations, the fear that once gripped an entire continent, let them recede, replaced by the steady rhythm of your own breathing, the comforting presence of the here and now. You've walked through a distant, difficult past, a world transformed by a pestilence almost beyond imagining, yet a world that, in its human responses, its despair and its hope, its follies and its courage, perhaps felt not entirely alien. The echoes of that time, the resilience of those who survived and rebuilt, the slow dawning of understanding, these are the threads that connect us across the centuries. But now it is time for rest, for the peace that comes with the closing of a long and somber tale. Let the weight of history settle, not as a burden, but as a deep underlying current that has shaped the world you know. And then let it go. Feel the stillness surround you, the quiet of the night, and allow yourself to drift, untroubled, into the restorative embrace of sleep. The story is told, the past can rest, and so can you. Sweet dreams.